Picture this, a spring morning in 1897, Madison, New Jersey, where the morning mist still clings to rolling hills that will soon be transformed into something unprecedented in American history. A man stands on a windswept ridge, his expensive coat flapping in the cold air, surveying 750 acres of farmland that he's just purchased for what many consider an obscene sum. Hamilton McCown Twombly, financier, railroad magnate, and husband to Florence Adele Vanderbilt, granddaughter of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, is about to embark on the construction of what will become one of the most extravagant private residences ever built on American soil. But what price will be paid for this monument to Gilded Age excess? What dark truths lie beneath the glittering facade of marble, gold, and imported treasures? What happens when the very foundations of wealth that built such a palace begin to crumble, and what becomes of those, the invisible army of servants, craftsmen, and laborers, whose lives are consumed in service to someone else's vision of paradise? This is not just the story of a house, it's the story of an empire's hubris, a family's desperate need to outshine all others, and the inevitable reckoning that comes when ambition constructs monuments too grand for mortality to sustain. Stand here with me now, and I'll tell you about Florham, a name that once whispered of unimaginable wealth and power, now barely remembered except by historians and ghost hunters who claim to hear the echoes of a world that died with the crash of 1929 and the slow, painful dissolution of American aristocracy. Hamilton Twombly was born in 1847 into comfortable circumstances, but not the kind of wealth that would define his adult life. His father was a successful businessman, his mother from a respectable family, but Hamilton himself was sickly as a child, plagued by respiratory ailments that kept him indoors while other boys played. These long hours of isolation bred in him an obsessive attention to detail, a need for control, and perhaps most significantly, an insatiable hunger to prove himself worthy, not through physical prowess, which his body denied him, but through the accumulation and display of wealth and taste. He studied at Yale, where he was known more for his expensive wardrobe than his academic achievements, and upon graduation, he entered the world of finance with the calculated precision of a chess master. But Hamilton's true fortune came not from his own brilliance, but from his marriage in 1877 to Florence Adele Vanderbilt, known to intimates as Flo. Florence was no ordinary heiress, she was the eldest daughter of William Henry Vanderbilt, who had inherited the vast railroad empire of his father, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, and had doubled it within 8 years, making him the richest man in America at the time of his death in 1885. When Florence married Hamilton, her dowry was staggering even by Vanderbilt standards. She inherited millions in railroad stock, bonds, and real estate, instantly catapulting the Twomblys into the uppermost echelon of American wealth. But here's the dark truth that polite society whispered behind silk fans and over brandy. Hamilton was always seen as Mr. Vanderbilt's son-in-law, never quite his own man, and this perceived subordination gnawed at him. He served as a director on numerous railroad boards, managed vast investment portfolios, and wielded significant power in the financial markets, but in the social sphere of New York's 400, that exclusive circle of old money families deemed worthy by social arbiter Caroline Astor, he was forever marked as the man who married into greatness rather than earning it himself. This insecurity, this need to prove his worthiness, would manifest in the most spectacular way possible, the construction of Florham. The decision to build Florham came in the mid-1890s, during what historians now call the absolute zenith of the Gilded Age, that period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War I, when industrial capitalism created fortunes of unprecedented scale and American millionaires competed in ostentatious displays of wealth that would make Roman emperors blush. The Vanderbilt family had already established a pattern of architectural one-upmanship. Florence's brother, Cornelius Vanderbilt too, had built the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace that cost $7 million, roughly $200 million today. Her other brother, William K. Vanderbilt, commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design Marble House, also in Newport, as a birthday present for his wife, spending $11 million on the structure and furnishings. But Hamilton and Florence wanted something different, something that would surpass even these monuments to excess, not just a summer cottage in Newport where they'd be surrounded by rival families all vying for the same social crown, but a year-round country seat that would evoke the great estates of England and France, a place where they could entertain on a scale that would cement their position as American royalty. They chose Madison, New Jersey, partly for its proximity to New York City, about 30 miles west, partly for its gently rolling landscape that reminded Florence of the English countryside she'd fallen in love with during European tours, and partly because the land was cheap enough that they could assemble a massive estate without the inflated prices of more fashionable areas. The name Florham itself was a combination of their first names, Flor from Florence and Ham from Hamilton, a detail that seems almost touching until you consider it as another calculated move in the game of legacy, ensuring that both names would be forever linked to this monument. They hired the prestigious architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White, the same firm that had designed the original Pennsylvania Station, the Boston Public Library, and numerous mansions for America's elite. Stanford White, the brilliant and ultimately tragic partner who would be murdered in 1906 by the jealous husband of his former mistress, took personal charge of the Florham project, seeing in it an opportunity to create an American interpretation of an English Georgian manor house on a scale never before attempted. The plans were staggering: a main house of over 100 rooms, not including the countless service areas, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces, two perfectly symmetrical wings extending from a central block, creating a facade nearly 400 feet long, walls of brick made from clay dug on the property itself, each brick individually inspected for color consistency, a roof of specially imported slate that would shimmer in shades of gray and purple depending on the light, and windows, hundreds upon hundreds of windows, each one custom-made, many with imported glass. But the house itself was only the beginning. The estate would also include a working farm with state-of-the-art dairy barns designed to Twombly's exacting specifications, stables for dozens of horses, a carriage house that could accommodate the family's fleet of vehicles, multiple greenhouses for year-round flowers and exotic plants, a gate lodge, a superintendent's house, cottages for senior staff, a vast complex of service buildings, and landscape gardens that would require a small army of gardeners to maintain. Construction began in 1893, and immediately the scale of the project revealed itself in ways that stunned even the experienced contractors. The site itself required extensive preparation. Hills were leveled, valleys filled, drainage systems installed, and a new access road built to accommodate the constant stream of supply wagons. Twombly insisted on absolute perfection, personally inspecting materials and sometimes ordering entire sections torn down and rebuilt if they didn't meet his standards. He imported craftsmen from Europe, stonemasons from Italy, woodcarvers from England, plasterers from France, and housed them in temporary barracks on the property. The working conditions were brutal by modern standards. Men labored 6 days a week, often 10 to 12 hours a day, for wages that seem laughable now but were considered decent for the time. Yet here's what the official histories rarely emphasize: the accidents. Construction of this scale and complexity, rushed to meet the demanding timeline set by an impatient millionaire, inevitably led to injuries and deaths. A stonemason fell from scaffolding and broke his back, spending the rest of his short life paralyzed. A carpenter lost 3 fingers to a saw. A laborer was crushed when a load of bricks shifted on a wagon. Others suffered from the harsh winters, working outdoors in conditions that would be illegal today. There are no monuments to these men, no plaques bearing their names, and the Twombleys certainly never mentioned them in their correspondence or dinner conversation. They were invisible, expendable, the necessary sacrifice to the gods of grandeur and social status. The main house, when finally completed in 1897, was a breathtaking achievement of American craftsmanship and European-inspired design. The facade presented a masterful composition of Georgian proportions, perfectly symmetrical, with a central pediment supported by massive Corinthian columns, flanked by 2-story wings that stretched out like welcoming arms. Visitors approached via a long, tree-lined drive that gradually revealed the house in a carefully orchestrated visual sequence, building anticipation with each curve until finally, at the top of a gentle rise, the full glory of Florham burst into view, its brick walls glowing warm in the afternoon sun, its hundreds of windows reflecting the sky like a face studded with jewels. The entrance hall set the tone for everything that followed, a vast space rising 2 full stories, floored in black and white marble laid in a geometric pattern that dazzled the eye, walls paneled in carved mahogany imported from Honduras, and overhead, a ceiling painted with classical motifs by an Italian master who spent 6 months on his back, Renaissance style, bringing mythological scenes to life. A grand staircase swept upward in a graceful curve, its balustrade carved from single pieces of mahogany, each newel post topped with an urn-shaped finial, the whole illuminated by an enormous chandelier that held over 100 electric bulbs, electricity being still enough of a novelty in 1897 that having it in a private home was itself a status symbol. From the entrance hall, visitors could proceed to the formal reception rooms that occupied the ground floor of the main block, a drawing room decorated in the French Louis XV style, with walls covered in pale blue silk damask, furniture upholstered in needlepoint that had taken a team of women 3 years to complete, and a fireplace of carved Carrara marble that had been commissioned from an Italian workshop and shipped across the Atlantic in pieces, a library paneled entirely in English oak, with floor-to-ceiling bookcases holding first editions and rare manuscripts that Hamilton collected more for their investment value and prestige than for any genuine love of literature, a music room with acoustics carefully designed by a specialist, containing a Steinway grand piano, multiple seating arrangements for intimate concerts, and display cases for Florence's collection of antique musical instruments, and the piece de resistance, the ballroom, which occupied much of one wing and could accommodate 200 guests for dancing, with walls of sienna marble, a floor of parquetry in 9 different woods arranged in a sunburst pattern, and French doors opening onto a terrace that overlooked the formal gardens. The dining room was a study in calculated magnificence, designed not just to feed guests but to overwhelm them with evidence of the Twombly's wealth and taste. The table, when fully extended, could seat 40 people and was laid with china commissioned from Limoges, each piece bearing the Twombly crest that Hamilton had designed. Never mind that the family had no actual aristocratic lineage. In America, you could simply commission a coat of arms and claim it as ancestral. Crystal from baccarat that caught the light from another massive chandelier and scattered rainbow prisms across the damask tablecloths, and silver serving pieces that filled an entire vault in the butler's pantry, requiring 2 footmen just to carry in the tureens and platters for a formal dinner. The walls were hung with paintings that Hamilton and Florence had acquired during their European travels, not necessarily because they loved art, but because having old masters on your walls was what cultured millionaires did. Some were genuine, purchased from impoverished European aristocrats selling off family heirlooms. Others were skilled copies that the Twomblys may or may not have known were forgeries. All of them served the same purpose of demonstrating that the Twomblys had the wealth and connections to acquire such treasures. But perhaps the most revealing spaces were the private apartments on the 2nd floor, where the public performance of wealth gave way to something more intimate and, in many ways, more telling. Hamilton and Florence maintained separate bedroom suites, as was common among their class, separate rooms for sleeping, dressing, and bathing, connected by a private sitting room where they could meet without the observation of servants. Florence's rooms were decorated in a delicate feminine style, all pastels and florals, with a bathroom that featured a sunken marble tub, gilded fixtures, and both hot and cold running water, still a luxury in 1897. Her dressing room was lined with closets and drawers for her enormous wardrobe. She was known to order dozens of dresses from Paris each season, wearing many of them only once before discarding them, and lit by large windows that faced south to catch the best natural light for applying makeup and judging the effect of her toilette. Hamilton's rooms were more masculine and austere, dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and a massive desk where he would spend hours each morning reviewing financial reports and correspondence from his various business interests. His bathroom was equipped with the latest in modern plumbing, including a shower, a relatively new invention that many still viewed with suspicion, preferring the traditional tub. These private spaces reveal something important about the Twomblys' marriage. It was, by all contemporary accounts, affectionate but not passionate, a partnership of mutual benefit and genuine companionship but not the grand romantic love celebrated in novels. They had no children, which was a source of quiet sorrow to Florence and perhaps relief to Hamilton, who had never shown much interest in family life and who worried that children would only complicate the disposition of their fortune. The guest suites, of which there were over a dozen, ranged from merely luxurious to absolutely opulent, each decorated in a different style: French Empire, English Tudor, Italian Renaissance, allowing guests to choose their preferred aesthetic atmosphere. Each suite included a bedroom, sitting room, and private bathroom, a level of comfort and privacy that was extraordinary for the time and designed to make guests feel that staying at Florham was an experience of unparalleled privilege. But here's what visitors didn't see, what they were never meant to see: the vast infrastructure of service that made this palace of leisure function. Below the main floors and behind carefully concealed doors stretched a labyrinthine world of service corridors, workrooms, storage spaces, and staff quarters that occupied nearly as much space as the public areas but were designed to be completely invisible to the Twomblys and their guests. The kitchen complex alone was a marvel of industrial efficiency, a main kitchen with 3 massive coal-burning ranges, each requiring constant attention from kitchen maids who started their shifts at 5 a.m. to have the fires ready for breakfast preparation, a pastry kitchen where a dedicated pastry chef and 2 assistants created the elaborate desserts that were de rigueur for formal dinners, a scullery where an army of maids washed dishes, pots, and pans in scalding water, their hands red and raw from the constant immersion, a larder for storing perishables, kept cool by blocks of ice that were delivered daily and hauled down to the basement by muscular icemen, dry storage rooms for staples, a wine cellar that held thousands of bottles, each carefully catalogued and maintained at precise temperatures, and a butler's pantry where the silver was cleaned, counted, and secured each night. The service corridors were deliberately narrow and plain, painted in institutional colors, designed to allow servants to move quickly and efficiently while remaining unobtrusive. Strategic doors concealed these passages from the main rooms, and servants were trained to listen before emerging, ensuring they never accidentally interrupted a private conversation or startled a guest. The staff quarters on the upper floors were Spartan compared to the rest of the house, small rooms, often shared by 2 or more servants, with simple iron bedsteads, plain wooden furniture, and minimal decoration. There was a clear hierarchy even among the servants. Senior staff like the butler, housekeeper, and Florence's lady's maid had private rooms and were addressed as Mr. or Mrs. by junior staff. Junior staff were addressed only by their first names, or often just generic names like Mary for all housemaids, regardless of their actual names. And outdoor staff like gardeners and stable hands were housed in separate buildings and considered even lower in status. Running Florham required a full-time staff of approximately 60 people during the social season and never fewer than 40 even during quiet months, a butler who oversaw all male servants and managed the wine cellar and dining room, a housekeeper who managed all female indoor servants and maintained inventory of household supplies, Florence's lady's maid who attended to her personal needs and was responsible for her wardrobe, Hamilton's valet who performed similar duties for him, a chef trained in classical French cuisine who ruled the kitchen with tyrannical authority, multiple assistant cooks and kitchen maids, housemaids who cleaned the endless rooms, dusted the thousands of objects, and changed the linens, footmen who served at table, answered doors, and carried out various tasks for the family, laundry maids who washed, ironed, and mended the constant flow of linens and clothing, a head gardener who oversaw the maintenance of the grounds and greenhouses with a team of subordinate gardeners, stable hands and grooms for the horses, a coachman and later a chauffeur when automobiles were added to the estate, and various other specialized staff including a secretary, engineers to maintain the mechanical systems, and estate workers who maintained the working farm. What was life like for these invisible people who made Florham function? We can reconstruct it from estate records, servants' memoirs from similar households, and the occasional letter or diary entry that survived. Their days began early, often before dawn, and ended late, with schedules dictated entirely by the needs and whims of the family and their guests. A housemaid's day might begin at 5:30 a.m., when she would creep through the quiet house lighting fires in the bedrooms so that they would be warm when the family arose, carrying heavy buckets of coal up multiple flights of stairs, trying to complete this dirty work before anyone saw her, then returning to her own quarters to wash the coal dust from her hands and face before beginning her cleaning rounds. Meals were taken in the servants' hall, a large but plain room in the basement, with strict seating arrangements that reflected the hierarchy, senior staff at the head of the table, junior staff at the foot, and everyone eating in silence or near silence unless specifically given permission to speak by the butler or housekeeper. The food was generally good, one benefit of working in a wealthy household, though certainly not the elaborate dishes served upstairs. There were rare half-days off, perhaps once a week if the household schedule permitted, when servants might walk into Madison Village, attend a church service, or simply sleep. Romantic relationships were discouraged and often forbidden, especially for female staff, who could be dismissed immediately if found to be keeping company with a man. Pregnancy was grounds for instant termination without references, effectively ending a servant's career and often forcing desperate women into poverty or prostitution. The workload was relentless, the physical demands brutal, and the constant surveillance exhausting. Senior staff monitored junior staff, and the family monitored everyone, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where anyone could be dismissed for the smallest infraction or even just because their face no longer pleased Mrs. Twombly. Yet many servants stayed for years, even decades, because despite the hardships, employment at a household like Florham offered relative stability, a certain prestige. Working for a Vanderbilt connection was a mark of distinction among servants, and for some, particularly those in senior positions, salaries that could not be matched elsewhere. But let's be clear about what this really was, a system of class exploitation that gave wealthy families absolute power over the lives of working people who had few other options. Servants could be dismissed without notice, without severance, and without references, effectively destroying their ability to find new employment. They had no legal protections, no recourse if they were abused or underpaid, no privacy, and no autonomy. The relationship was fundamentally feudal, a remnant of aristocratic social structures transplanted to supposedly democratic America, where it flourished in the soil of industrial capitalism's inequality. The Twombleys would have been horrified by such a characterization. Of course, they believed themselves to be benevolent employers who provided good wages and working conditions. Florence, in particular, fashioned herself as a caring mistress who took an interest in her servants' welfare, occasionally giving bonuses at Christmas, providing basic medical care when someone fell ill, and maintaining a gracious manner in her interactions with senior staff. But this paternalistic kindness was always conditional, always revocable, and always entirely on her terms. It was a performance of noblesse oblige that reinforced rather than challenged the fundamental inequality of the relationship. Now, with Florham complete and fully staffed, Hamilton and Florence could begin to use it for its intended purpose, to solidify their position at the absolute pinnacle of American society and to entertain on a scale that would make them legendary. The guest lists for weekend parties at Florham read like a who's who of Gilded Age America: fellow Vanderbilts, of course, including Florence's brothers and their families; Astors, including Caroline, the Mrs. Astor herself, whose approval could make or break a social reputation; European aristocrats touring America in search of heiresses for their impoverished sons to marry; politicians, including senators and even presidents. Both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft would visit Florham. During their terms, financiers like J.P. Morgan and his associates, and artists, writers, and intellectuals who added cultural cachet to what might otherwise be dismissed as merely vulgar displays of wealth. These weekend parties followed a carefully orchestrated schedule designed to display the estate's magnificence while allowing guests to feel simultaneously pampered and important. Guests would arrive Friday afternoon, often traveling from New York City in private railroad cars, another Vanderbilt perk, to the local station, where the Twomblys' carriages and later automobiles would collect them. Upon arrival at Florham, they would be shown to their assigned suites, where they would find fresh flowers, bowls of fruit, the latest books and magazines, and perhaps a small personal gift from their hosts, all details that required enormous coordination by the staff but which were meant to seem effortlessly natural. Friday evening would typically feature a formal dinner with multiple courses: oysters, soup, fish, sorbet to cleanse the palate, a meat course, salad, cheese, dessert, and finally coffee and liqueurs, each course accompanied by a different wine, the whole meal lasting 3 hours or more and requiring constant attention from the serving staff. After dinner, the party might repair to the music room for a concert, or to the library for cards and conversation, or in warmer months, onto the terrace for cigars and brandy while the stars emerged overhead. Saturday would begin with breakfast, either in the dining room or delivered to guest suites, followed by organized activities, tours of the estate, hunting or fishing for the men, garden walks for the ladies, perhaps lawn tennis or croquet on the manicured lawns. Lunch would be a lighter affair than dinner but still elaborate by ordinary standards, and afternoon might bring more activities or a rest period before the main event, Saturday night's dinner and ball. The ballroom would be opened, the orchestra, hired from New York for the occasion, would take their positions, and after another interminable dinner, guests would dance until the early hours of Sunday morning. Sunday would be more relaxed, with a late breakfast, perhaps attendance at a local church, more for show than devotion, a final lunch, and then departure, with guests effusive in their thanks and the Twomblys graciously accepting compliments on their hospitality while already planning the next event. But what was really happening beneath all this choreographed elegance? Business, primarily, the kind of business that was never acknowledged as such but which was the real point of these gatherings. In the library over brandy and cigars, railroad deals were struck, investment opportunities discussed, political alliances formed, and marriages arranged between children of different wealthy families, uniting fortunes and consolidating power. The women, meanwhile, conducted their own business in the drawing rooms and gardens, managing social alliances, gathering gossip that could be weaponized, and maneuvering their daughters and nieces into advantageous positions. Florham was performing its function as a machine for social advancement and wealth consolidation, a purpose for which it had been deliberately and carefully designed. For about 15 years, from 1897 to the early 1910s, Florham functioned exactly as Hamilton and Florence had envisioned, a stage for their performance of aristocratic leisure, a fortress of privilege from which they could look down on the rest of America, secure in their wealth and status. But already, even during these golden years, there were shadows gathering that would eventually engulf not just Florham but the entire world it represented. The first shadow was political. The progressive movement was gaining strength, with muckraking journalists exposing the corrupt practices by which many fortunes had been built, labor unions organizing to challenge the absolute power of capitalists, and politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, despite his own wealthy background and his visits to estates like Florham, calling for reform, regulation, and, most ominously for people like the Twomblys, income and inheritance taxes. The federal income tax, first instituted during the Civil War and then allowed to lapse, was revived by the 16th Amendment in 1913, and suddenly the government had a claim on the vast fortunes that had previously been entirely private. Estate taxes would follow, making it increasingly difficult to pass wealth intact from one generation to the next. The second shadow was cultural. The very excess that Florham represented was beginning to seem embarrassing, even obscene, to a new generation that questioned whether such extreme inequality was compatible with democratic values. Writers and social critics were articulating a devastating critique of Gilded Age plutocracy. Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class, published in 1899, introduced the term conspicuous consumption to describe exactly what the Twomblies and their peers were doing, and the term was not meant as a compliment. The third shadow was personal. Hamilton and Florence were aging, both suffering from various ailments, and they had no children to inherit Florham and carry on their legacy. Florence was particularly troubled by this, as she watched her brother's children grow up and realized that the Twombly line would end with her and Hamilton. They discussed adoption, but Hamilton was unenthusiastic, and nothing came of it. This left the question, what would happen to Florham when they were gone? The fourth and most catastrophic shadow was economic and geopolitical. World War I was brewing in Europe, and although few Americans anticipated it in the peaceful summers before 1914, that war would shatter the world order on which the Gilded Age had been built, destroy the illusion of perpetual progress and stability, and inaugurate an era of violence and upheaval that would eventually sweep away most of the great fortunes and estates of the pre-war era. When war broke out in August 1914, it seemed at first like a distant European problem that might even benefit American business interests, and indeed, the Twombly's investments in companies supplying war materials proved hugely profitable in the early years. But as the war ground on, becoming ever more brutal and totalizing, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. The old aristocratic order of Europe, to which wealthy Americans like the Twombly's had looked for cultural models and legitimacy, was literally tearing itself apart. Ancient families were losing their sons in the trenches, their fortunes to war taxes, and their estates to requisition by governments desperate for resources. When America entered the war in 1917, the impact became more personal. Young men from Madison and the surrounding area were drafted and sent to France, including some from the families of Florham's staff, and the estate itself was touched by the mobilization effort, with Hamilton making substantial voluntary contributions to war bond drives and Florence organizing charity events to support the troops. But the real impact came after the war, in the 1920s, when it became clear that the pre-war world was never coming back. The economy was disrupted, the social order was in flux, and new cultural values emphasizing modernity, democracy, and informality were replacing the rigid hierarchies and elaborate protocols of the Gilded Age. Florence died in 1920, and the loss devastated Hamilton. He had genuinely loved her, perhaps not with youthful passion but with the deep companionate affection of partners who had built a life together, and her death left him alone in the enormous house that they had created as a shared project. He continued to maintain Florham for a few years, but his heart wasn't in it. The parties ceased, guests were rarely invited, and the house began to feel like a mausoleum, its vast rooms echoing with memories of vanished splendor. Hamilton himself died in 1929, just months before the stock market crash that would have devastated even his vast fortune. His death marked the end of an era, and the question of Florham's fate became urgent. Hamilton's will left the bulk of his estate to various nieces and nephews from the Vanderbilt side of the family, but none of them wanted Florham. It was too expensive to maintain, too old-fashioned for the new century, too much a relic of a discredited past. The estate was put up for sale, but in the depths of the Depression, who could afford such a place, and even if they could, who would want it? Florham sat empty for several years, a ghost palace haunted by its own history, while the furnishings were gradually sold off at auction, the art dispersed, the silver and china packed away. The staff was dismissed, most without pensions or provisions for their futures, their decades of service ending with a final paycheck and a curt letter of reference if they were lucky. Some of the elderly servants, who had spent their entire adult lives at Florham and had nowhere else to go, faced genuinely dire circumstances, ending up in poorhouses or dependent on reluctant relatives, a fact that received no mention in the society pages that had once breathlessly chronicled the Twombly's parties. The house itself began to deteriorate without constant maintenance, leaks developed in the roof, windows broke and weren't replaced, the heating system failed, and vandals or souvenir hunters broke in to steal whatever remained of value. By the mid-1930s, Florham looked less like a palace and more like a ruin, a testament to the fragility of wealth and the impermanence of all human endeavors. But then, in 1937, an unlikely savior appeared, Fairleigh S. Dickinson, a self-made businessman who had founded a successful pharmaceutical company and now wanted to create a lasting legacy of his own. Dickinson purchased Florham and the surrounding land with a specific purpose in mind, to establish a college that would provide educational opportunities to students who might not otherwise have access to higher education, particularly working-class and first-generation college students. The symbolism was almost too perfect, a monument to aristocratic excess transformed into an institution of democratic education, a private palace open to the public good. Fairleigh Dickinson University's Florham campus opened in 1958, and it continues to operate today, with the original Twombly Mansion serving as the main administrative building and various newer structures added to accommodate dormitories, classrooms, and other facilities. Students now walk the same halls where robber barons once plotted their deals, study in rooms where orchestras once played for dancing debutantes, and eat their cafeteria meals in spaces where servants once scurried to fulfill their master's every whim. The transformation is profound and in many ways redemptive, a genuine repurposing that gives Florham new meaning and social value. Yet the university's stewardship of Florham has not been without controversy or challenges. The original house, while maintained, has been altered, some would say compromised, by the necessary adaptations for institutional use, partitions installed in grand rooms to create offices, acoustic tiles covering ornate plaster ceilings, modern fluorescent lighting replacing period chandeliers, handicap ramps and elevators added to improve accessibility but disrupting the original architectural flow. Some preservation advocates argue that the university has not done enough to protect Florham's historic integrity, that the changes have been too extensive and too insensitive, that what remains is more a simulacrum than a restoration. The university counters that Florham is a living institution, not a museum, and that the house's survival in any form is a success given how many similar estates were demolished. Both positions have merit, and the tension between preservation and adaptation remains unresolved. Moreover, there's a legitimate question about what story Florham should tell. The university's promotional materials tend to emphasize the grandeur and the Gilded Age charm of the campus, presenting it as a picturesque setting that enhances the college experience, which is fine as far as it goes, but it risks romanticizing a deeply problematic history. Where are the interpretive markers discussing the exploited labor that built and maintained Florham? Where is the honest reckoning with the extreme inequality that made such estates possible? Where is the acknowledgement that the Vanderbilt fortune, from which the Twombly's wealth derived, was built on ruthless business practices that crushed competitors, exploited workers, and sometimes bent or broke laws? These are uncomfortable questions, but avoiding them means perpetuating a sanitized, fairy tale version of history that obscures the human costs of the Gilded Age's gilded surface. Some scholars and historians associated with the university have begun to address these issues, conducting research into the servants' lives, documenting the estate's labor history, and developing educational programs that encourage students to think critically about the social and economic context in which Florham was created. This work is important and necessary, but it remains marginal to the institution's primary identity and mission. There's also the question of access and who gets to experience Florham today. As a private university, Fairleigh Dickinson controls access to the campus, and while there are occasional public tours and events, Florham is not freely open to the public in the way that, say, National Trust properties are. This means that Florham's transformation from private to public is incomplete. It's more public than it was under the Twomblys, certainly, but still restricted primarily to those who can afford college tuition or who are specifically invited for university-sanctioned events. The irony is that the wealthy donors who support the university often tour Florham and express nostalgia for the Gilded Age, perhaps imagining themselves as the spiritual heirs to the Twomblys, while the working-class students whom Dickinson originally intended to serve may attend classes in the building without ever learning its full history or considering what it represents. Beyond the campus itself, Florham's influence extends in unexpected ways. The aesthetic language of the estate, the Georgian symmetry, the imported European elegance, the carefully manicured landscapes, has become part of the visual shorthand for old money and elite institutions in American culture. Countless films, television shows, and advertisements have used locations like Florham or sets modeled on estates like it to signify wealth, power, and establishment prestige. This image-making has real consequences, shaping public perceptions of what success looks like and reinforcing aspirational narratives that ultimately serve to legitimize inequality. When we see these beautiful spaces on screen, we're being sold a story about wealth as natural, deserved, and aesthetically superior, a story that obscures the mechanisms by which wealth is actually acquired and maintained, and the social costs it imposes. What, then, is Florham's ultimate legacy? That depends on who's telling the story and for what purpose. For the Twombly descendants who inherited fragments of the family fortune, Florham might represent a lost golden age of family glory, a source of pride and wistfulness. For Fairleigh Dickinson University, Florham is a valuable asset, a beautiful campus, a fundraising draw, and a symbol of the institution's history and aspirations, though one whose complicated past requires careful management. For preservationists and architectural historians, Florham is an important example of Gilded Age design by a significant architectural firm, worthy of study and protection despite the moral ambiguities of its origins. For labor historians and social critics, Florham is evidence of the extreme inequality and exploitation that characterized the period, a monument that should provoke critical reflection rather than nostalgic admiration. For the local community in Madison, Florham is a major employer and economic driver, but also a symbol of the town's complicated relationship with wealth and exclusivity. And for the ghosts, metaphorical if not literal, of the servants who spent their lives maintaining this palace, Florham might represent the ultimate injustice, that they are forgotten while the names Vanderbilt and Twombly are still remembered, that their labor is erased while the luxury it enabled is preserved and celebrated. But perhaps the most important legacy of Florham is as a mirror, a surface that reflects back whatever we bring to it. If we approach it with romantic nostalgia for a supposedly genteel past, we'll see elegance and beauty while overlooking the exploitation and inequality. If we approach it with righteous anger at the excesses of the rich, we'll see a monument to greed and injustice. If we approach it with historical curiosity and critical thinking, we might see something more complex, a place that embodies both human aspiration and human failing, that demonstrates both what we're capable of creating and what we're capable of ignoring, that challenges us to consider the relationship between beauty and justice, between private luxury and public welfare, between individual ambition and collective responsibility. Stand with me now, one more time, on that ridge in Madison where Hamilton Twombly once stood surveying his future domain. The trees have grown tall, the landscape has changed, and the world that made Florham possible has long since vanished. Students hurry across the grounds to classes, perhaps pausing occasionally to admire the building's facade or to study in the shade of old trees, mostly unaware of the full story beneath their feet. The story of Florham is ultimately America's story, a story of immense ambition and creativity, of beautiful things built by exploited hands, of a society divided between those who lived in palaces and those who served in them, of the fragility of even the greatest fortunes, and of the possibility, however imperfect, of transformation and redemption. It asks us uncomfortable questions. What are we building today that future generations will judge as harshly as we might judge Florham? Whose invisible labor supports our comforts and privileges? What responsibilities come with wealth and power? What endures beyond money, beyond monuments, beyond the brief flash of a human life? These questions have no easy answers, but asking them is essential if we're to learn anything from history beyond a superficial appreciation for architectural beauty. Florham reminds us that nothing lasts forever, not wealth, not power, not the social structures that seem eternal to those living within them. It reminds us that the grandest houses become empty when their purposes disappear, that fortunes dissipate, that names fade, and that only by transforming our legacies into something larger than personal or family glory can we hope to create meaning that survives us. Hamilton and Florence Twombly wanted to build a monument to their position in society, a place where they would be celebrated and remembered as American aristocracy. They succeeded in building something magnificent, but it endures not as they intended, not as a shrine to their memory, but as an educational institution serving purposes they likely never imagined, and as a historical document that testifies to both the achievements and the failures of their age. Is that a tragedy? Perhaps. But it's also something more profound, a demonstration that history moves on, that values change, that what seems eternal in one moment becomes obsolete in the next, and that our only choice is whether to cling desperately to fading glory or to allow our creations to be transformed into something new and potentially more meaningful. The dark truth that Florham's walls could tell, if walls could speak, is that all the wealth, all the beauty, all the careful social positioning and status-seeking that consumed the Twomblys' lives ultimately meant nothing when measured against the vast forces of historical change. But the light truth, the hopeful counterpoint, is that something did endure, not the family name or the fortune, but the physical structure itself, repurposed and given new meaning, still beautiful, still useful, still teaching lessons, though not the ones Hamilton and Florence intended. And in that transformation from private excess to public institution, from aristocratic fantasy to democratic reality, we might find some small measure of redemption, some suggestion that even our most self-indulgent creations can be salvaged and redeemed by future generations who see possibilities their builders never imagined. So the next time you see a grand estate, whether in person or in the carefully curated images of wealth that saturate our media landscape, ask yourself, who built this? Who maintained it? What did it cost, and I don't mean just in dollars. What happened to the people whose names we don't remember but whose labor made such magnificence possible? And what will remain when the money is gone, the family forgotten, and the purposes for which it was built have become irrelevant? These questions matter because they force us to look beyond the seductive surface of beauty and wealth to the human realities beneath, to recognize that every grand structure is also a story about power, about inequality, about the choices societies make regarding who gets to live in palaces and who gets to scrub their floors. Florham, in the end, is not just about one family or one house, it's about all of us, about the world we inherit, the world we create, and the world we leave behind, about the permanent tension between our aspirations for transcendent beauty and our all-too-human capacity for exploitation and injustice, about memory and forgetting, about the weight of history and the possibility of transformation. And if we're honest with ourselves, if we truly listen to what Florham and estates like it are trying to tell us, we'll recognize that the story isn't finished, that we are still, in our own ways, building monuments to our ambitions, still dividing the world between those who are served and those who serve, still choosing between creating beauty that includes everyone and beauty that excludes most people, still deciding what kind of legacy we want to leave. The tragedy of Florham is not just that it represents a vanished world, but that in so many ways, the fundamental inequalities and moral compromises it embodied are still with us, wearing new clothes and speaking a different language but operating according to the same brutal logic that says some lives matter more than others, that wealth justifies itself, that those at the top deserve their position and those at the bottom should be grateful for whatever crumbs fall from the table. Until we confront these uncomfortable truths, until we truly reckon with the costs of the gilded surfaces we admire, we're doomed to repeat the same patterns, building our own Florhams while telling ourselves we're different, better, more deserving, until time and history prove us wrong just as they proved the Twombly's wrong. That's the real lesson of Florham, the one that should haunt us as we walk through its elegant rooms or admire its perfect proportions, that beauty built on injustice is always fragile, that fortunes turn, that empires crumble, and that the only legacy worth leaving is one that acknowledges the full complexity of how it was achieved, that honors all the hands that built it, and that serves purposes larger than the glorification of a single family or class. Florham now has that chance, in its incarnation as an educational institution, to tell its full story, not just the fairy tale of Gilded Age glamour, but the dark truth of what that glamour cost and who paid the price. Whether it will fully embrace that responsibility, whether we as a society will demand such honesty from our institutions and from ourselves, remains to be seen, but the questions Florham asks will not go away simply because they make us uncomfortable, and the ghosts of those who built and maintained it without recognition or reward will not be laid to rest until their stories are told alongside the stories of the families whose names are carved above the doors and printed in the history books.